The bell above the door gave its familiar chime, the kind of sound that usually meant comfort, but today it felt heavier, almost final. The scent of the shop was the same as always. Old paper, faint traces of cedar from the shelves her father had built with his own hands, and a hint of the lavender oil her mother once used to dust the counter. But instead of feeling warm, it wrapped around her like a goodbye. Outside, the street was alive with the rhythm of the city, bus engines, hurried footsteps, muffled conversations. But in here, time had slowed. Sunlight poured through the front windows, touching the spines of the books in muted gold, as if trying to give them one last blessing. She walked between the shelves with deliberate slowness, fingertips brushing over titles she had known since she could read. Her father's presence was everywhere. His handwriting was still on the little price tags, slightly slanted, always in blue ink. The chair in the corner, with the cushions sunken from years of him sitting there to read to customers' children, stood exactly where it always had. She could still hear his voice if she closed her eyes, steady, warm, with a softness that could turn even the driest history book into an adventure. It was supposed to be forever. He had told her that once. Will live, pay over rising. She loved it, dying, tried everything, but nothing had. Every solution bought her only a little more time, and now time had finally run out. She had signed the papers that morning. In 2 days, the new owner would arrive, and the shop would no longer belong to her family. It would become something else, a cafe or a boutique, or worse, a soulless corporate outlet where the smell of old books would be replaced by the sterile scent of new plastic. She walked to the counter and ran her hand along the worn edge, feeling every dent and scratch like they were part of her own skin. This was where her father had leaned while listening to customers talk about their lives, where her mother had wrapped books in brown paper and tied them with string, where she had stood on a stool as a child to ring up her very first sale. The walls seemed to listen as she moved, as if the building itself understood the weight of her steps. In the far corner, the old record player still sat, a stack of vinyls beside it. Without thinking, she reached for her father's favorite, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and set the needle down. The first notes floated through the room, soft and melancholic, and something in her chest ached so deeply she had to steady herself against the counter. She imagined him there, humming along as he sorted the latest shipment, a mug of tea forgotten at his elbow. She imagined her younger self running to the back room to show him a story she had written in shaky handwriting. She imagined, and then stopped because imagining made the loss sharper. The light was changing now, slipping into the warm tones of late afternoon. It cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards, shadows that stretched like memories toward the door. She wondered if anyone passing outside could sense what was happening inside, that a chapter was ending. She found herself whispering into the empty room. "I'm sorry, Dad." Her voice cracked, the words catching somewhere between her throat and her heart. She wasn't just losing a store. She was losing a piece of him, a piece of herself. The chime over the door rang again. She straightened quickly, wiping at her eyes, expecting it to be a customer who had come to browse one last time. But the doorway was empty, just the wind pushing the door open slightly before letting it fall shut again. She laughed softly to herself, the sound brittle. "Even the wind saying goodbye," she murmured, and then she turned, her hand brushing against the old frame photograph of her father by the register. The glass was cool under her fingertips. She let them linger there, unwilling to move, because once she stepped away from that counter, she knew there was no pretending. This wasn't just the last day she'd work here. It was the last day this place would be hers. She thought the final days would be quiet, that the store would fade away the way old paper yellows, gradually and without spectacle. But on the second to last afternoon, someone came in. The bell above the door rang, and she instinctively looked up from the stack of unsorted books she'd been pretending to organize. A man had stepped inside, tall enough to brush the hanging ivy plant near the entrance with his shoulder. He paused just past the threshold, letting his eyes wander slowly over the space, like he wasn't just looking, he was absorbing. He didn't belong to the usual crowd, not one of the neighborhood regulars who came for paperbacks and casual conversation. His coat was tailored, his shoes polished to the kind of sheen that didn't happen by accident, yet his gaze wasn't dismissive the way wealthy passersby sometimes were when they wandered in out of curiosity. It was measured. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but distant. "Not yet." And there was a quiet certainty in his voice, and that had nothing to do with the shelves in front of him. She went back to her section. At one point, he stopped in front of the framed photograph of her father behind the counter. "That's the original owner?" he asked without looking away from it. She hesitated before answering. "Yes, my father." He nodded slightly. "He built this place well. It feels lived in." It was an odd choice of words, but something about the way he said them made her chest tighten. Few people noticed the soul of the place anymore. Most only saw its age, its fading paint, the scratches on the counter. After a while, he chose a book, a worn hardcover collection of short stories, and brought it to the counter. "This one," he said, sliding it toward her. She rang it up, feeling strangely aware of the quiet between them. When she handed him the bag, he didn't leave right away. He lingered, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. "Places like this don't exist much anymore," he said. "Once they're gone, they don't come back." She managed to smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "That's what makes them special while they last." He studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to say something else. Then he simply nodded, thanked her, and left. She told herself he was just another customer, albeit an unusually observant one. But that night, as she sat in the back room going through her father's old ledger, she couldn't stop replaying the way he had looked at the store, like he was memorizing it. The next day, he returned. This time, he didn't pretend to browse. He walked straight to the counter. "I heard the store's closing," he said. The words hit her like cold water. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter," he replied. "Is it true?" She didn't see the point in lying. "Yes, tomorrow's the last day." He glanced around the shop again, slower this time. "Your father built something worth keeping." Her throat tightened. "My father's gone, and keeping it isn't possible." His eyes returned to hers. They were steady, unflinching, but there was no pity in them, only a kind of resolve she didn't understand. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "what's possible depends on who's willing to make it so." She didn't know how to respond. Before she could find the words, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a card, and set it on the counter. "No obligations," he said. "Just call me if you change your mind about what's possible." She picked up the card after he left. There was no company name, no job title, just his name and a phone number printed in simple black ink. She turned it over in her hand, wondering why a stranger would care about the survival of a dying bookshop he'd only just discovered. And though she told herself she wouldn't, she slipped the card into the pocket of her apron instead of the trash. That night, she dreamed of the store as it had been when her father was alive, bright, warm, filled with laughter. She dreamed of strangers walking in and finding pieces of themselves on the shelves. And she dreamed of that man standing quietly in the corner, watching without intruding, as if he belonged there all along. When she woke, the card was still in her apron pocket, as if it had been waiting for her decision before she even knew she had one. The final day arrived, dressed in a quiet kind of grief. The sky outside was gray but calm, the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside with a warm drink and a good story. It was almost cruel how perfectly suited the day was for a bookstore. The bell over the door still rang occasionally, as it had for years, but the customers who came in were not here to browse. They were here to say goodbye. Some brought flowers. Others brought memories, stories about the first book they had bought here, or afternoons they'd spent in the corner armchair with her father recommending titles they didn't know they needed. She smiled and listened, but each goodbye was a small cut, and by the afternoon she felt as if she'd been carved hollow. By 5 o'clock the shop was nearly empty. Only a few boxes remained, half filled with the unsold books that would be sent away to warehouses or donated to libraries. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if taking her time would somehow stretch the day longer. The chime above the door startled her. She turned, and there he was again, the man with the quiet eyes and the tailored coat. "You came back," she said before she could stop herself. "I told you," he replied, stepping inside. "Places like this don't come back once they're gone." She folded her arms, bracing herself. "If you're here to convince me..." "I'm not," he interrupted gently. "I'm here because I need to ask you one question." Something in his tone made her pause. He stepped closer, scanning the room as though memorizing it for the last time. "What does this store mean to you?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to give a practical answer about her father, her childhood, but the words didn't come. Instead, she found herself staring at the counter where her father used to stand, the record player in the corner, the little notes she'd written to customers over the years and taped to shelves. "It's not just a store," she said finally, her voice low. "It's the last piece of my father I can still touch. When I lock that door for the last time, it's like I'm losing him again." He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady. When she finished, he nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Don't lock the door tonight," he said. She blinked. "What?" Leave it open. I'll be back tomorrow morning. She shook her head. Tomorrow the new owner. There won't be a new owner, he said quietly. The certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. What are you talking about? He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. I'm talking about this place staying yours. Stared at it. Hands itched to... The shop is no longer being sold to the buyer you signed with. That contract is gone. She froze. That's not possible. It is, he said simply. You'll see tomorrow. Before she could ask anything else, he turned toward the door. I'll be here at 9. And then he was gone, the bell above the door marking his exit with a sound that seemed louder than it ever had before. She stood in the middle of the store, the envelope still on the counter between her and the spot where he had been. Every instinct told her this was too good to be real, but every part of her heart, the part that still smelled the cedar shelves and heard her father's voice, wanted to believe it was. Outside, the gray light was fading into evening. She picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands, heavier than its size should allow, and in that moment she realized she wouldn't sleep that night. Morning came far too quickly. She had barely slept, the envelope resting on her nightstand like a silent question she wasn't ready to answer. More than once, she'd reached for it in the dark, her fingers brushing against its edges, tempted to open it just to end the uncertainty. But something in her told her to wait. At exactly 8:55 a.m., she was already at the shop, the lights on, the curtains pulled back. The air still carried the faint scent of yesterday's rain, mixing with the bookstore's usual perfume of old pages and wood polish. The street outside was quiet for now, just the occasional jogger, the hum of a delivery truck. She kept glancing at the door, every tick of the clock amplifying her heartbeat. Then, at precisely 9 the bell chimed. He stepped inside, dressed differently this time, less formal, but no less composed. He carried himself with the same quiet assurance, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Good morning, he said, as if this were any other day, as if yesterday's conversation had been nothing extraordinary. She didn't bother with small talk. What's in the envelope? Instead of answering directly, he placed a set of keys on the counter. They were old brass, slightly tarnished, but she recognized them instantly. They were the store's keys, her brow furrowed. I already have mine. Not these, he said. These are from the bank. The shop is yours again. No liens, no debts, paid in full. She stared at him, trying to process the words. That's impossible. I told you yesterday, he replied calmly. It's only impossible until someone decides it's not. Her mind scrambled for reasons. Why? Why would you do this for me? He leaned against the counter, his gaze unwavering. Because this place matters to you. And because sometimes proving you mean what you say requires more than words. Her throat tightened. She thought of her father, of all the times he had told her that people show who they are not through what they promise, but through what they're willing to sacrifice. She gestured toward the envelope. And that? That's the paperwork, he explained. Deeds, transfer documents, everything you need to know that I'm telling the truth. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The documents were real, the signatures were there. Her name printed clearly as the legal owner of the property. Her voice wavered. This must have cost... It doesn't matter, he cut in. The cost isn't the point. The weight of what he'd done settled over her like a tide, filling every empty space that had been carved out by months of worry and grief. But under the gratitude, a different emotion stirred, a cautious unease, because no one gave this much without a reason. What do you expect from me? She asked quietly. For the first time, his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Nothing you're not willing to give. They stood there in silence for a moment, the hum of the old refrigerator in the back room the only sound. Finally, he broke it. Come with me. She hesitated. Where? There's something I want to show you, something I think your father would have wanted you to see. The mention of her father's name, spoken so casually, yet with a kind of reverence, made her chest ache. Against her better judgment, she agreed. He led her outside, locking the door behind them, and they began walking down the street. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting long, warm light across the pavement. She noticed how he kept his pace matched to hers, not rushing, not lingering. After a few blocks, they turned into a narrow side street she rarely used. At the end of it stood another building, smaller than her bookstore, but with the same kind of charm. Its windows were covered with butcher paper, and a faint smell of fresh paint drifted from the doorway. He stopped in front of it. What is this? She asked. He smiled faintly. A place for what comes next. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but something told her that whatever was behind those paper-covered windows was connected to him in ways she hadn't yet begun to understand. She hesitated at the threshold, the paper-covered windows concealing whatever lay inside like a secret waiting to be unwrapped. The smell of fresh paint was stronger here, mingling with the faint scent of sawdust and something else. Coffee, maybe. Her fingers brushed against the doorframe as if she could read the story of this place through touch alone. He reached into his pocket, pulled out another set of keys, and unlocked the door. The hinges gave a soft groan, and the light that spilled into the room was golden, filtered through the morning sun. She stepped inside. It wasn't finished yet. She could see that immediately. The floors were newly sanded, their honeyed wood glowing under the light. A counter was half installed at the back, its polished surface reflecting the outlines of unopened boxes stacked neatly against the wall. Shelves lined the space, but instead of being crammed with books, they were bare, waiting. Her eyes caught on a small corner by the window where two worn armchairs sat side by side, mismatched but somehow perfectly placed. On the low table between them was a single framed photograph. Her father, smiling in front of the bookstore as it had looked 20 years ago. Her breath caught. How did you get this? I asked someone who knew him. He said simply. They told me this was his favorite picture. I thought it should be here. She turned to face him, questions colliding in her mind faster than she could ask them. What is this place? His eyes held hers. It's for you, for whatever you want it to be. She shook her head in disbelief. I don't understand. You already saved the bookstore. Why would you? Because saving the past isn't enough, he interrupted, his voice calm but carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. Your father built something beautiful, but you can build something of your own. This space, it's yours to shape. No debts, no conditions. She wanted to argue, to tell him that no one did things like this without expecting something in return. But every time she opened her mouth, the words dissolved before they could form. Instead, she wandered further inside, running her hand along the new shelves, imagining them filled, not just with books, but with pieces of herself. Events, workshops, maybe even a little cafe in the back. It was terrifying, the thought of starting something new, but the seed of possibility took root before she could stop it. When she reached the far wall, she noticed something else. An envelope sat on a stool, her name written across it in familiar handwriting. Her father's. Her chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. This isn't possible. He's been gone for years. I told you, the man said quietly. I asked someone who knew him. They'd been holding on to this, waiting for the right moment. Her throat felt too tight to speak. She slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter inside. My girl, it began, in the steady script she'd memorized as a child. If you're reading this, it means the store is no longer enough to hold the stories you carry. It means it's time to write your own. Her vision blurred. She didn't realize she was crying until a drop hit the paper. She read the rest in silence, each word sinking deeper than the last. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a permission she hadn't known she needed. When she looked up, he was watching her with the same steady calm as always. But there was something else in his expression now. Not just resolve, something closer to hope. You knew about this letter, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. I didn't know what it said, but I knew it belonged to you. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't empty. It felt like the space before a first page when anything could happen. Finally, she folded the letter carefully and set it back in the envelope. She placed it against her chest and took a deep breath. Why me? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was almost too soft to catch. Because some stories deserve to be rescued, and some people deserve to know they were worth saving.